Hello friends, it's Mike and it's January 12th, 2022 and I would like to wish everyone a happy new year. Let's hope it's a good one, to borrow a line from Mr. Lennon. What I'm going to discuss is something I've talked about before, but every once in a while I think it's worth revisiting. Obviously, as many of you already know, not everyone is on the same page within the Paul is Dead community. In fact, I have explained that the dynamics within a topic can be, and many times is, toxic. Within the Paul is Dead community, there is a faction which I refer to as the Justice for Paul gang. This group knows Bio Paul was replaced, but want, quote, justice to be served by taking down those they believe were responsible for his death. The primary target of their mission is Billy, who they refer to as Fall. They often discuss Paul in endearing terms as if they had a personal connection with him, when in fact, none of them knew him, and what they think they know is the result of conditioned thoughts and feelings developed by consuming mainstream narratives. Most of the people in this group believe the Beatles were an organic entity, four working-class lads from Liverpool, with fate connecting them to Brian Epstein, who was then able to get the Beatles signed to EMI under the tutelage of George Martin. They also believe the Beatles, specifically John Lennon and Paul McCartney, were prolific songwriting geniuses, and it was this talent that catapulted them to unparalleled success. This narrative is what I refer to as the Cinderella story. Their timeline of events goes something like this. They believe everything was going along smoothly until the Deep State decided to commandeer the band after the band's success in order to use the Beatles to serve Deep State interests. In other words, the controllers were asleep at the switch until they woke up in 1966. This takeover of the Beatles included the murder of Paul McCartney and replacing him with an operative who they refer to as Fall. Some within this group also believe that it wasn't just Paul that was taken out, but all four Beatles were killed and replaced, and going forward, the band was comprised of imposters. They believe that Bio Paul was a songwriting prodigy who had his life cut short, and therefore his legacy was truncated and must be restored. Their research focuses primarily on trying to prove to people that Bio Paul was replaced, and have been making claims for years about how they're going to expose Fall, have him arrested, and by doing this, Bio Paul's reputation will be restored, ensuring his proper place in the annals of history. The obsession with Paul McCartney and the Beatles as a whole is known as Paulism. Paulism is a religion created by the social engineers of Tavistock, where Paul McCartney and the Beatles are considered gods in the minds of the fans. Along with being a religion, Paulism is a social engineering movement which was created by Tavistock to break down pre-1962 societal and cultural norms, one of which being Christianity itself, in order to move the world into a completely different mindset and construct. The behavioral changes were introduced through rock music by psychologically conditioning the masses to accept and engage in non-compliance, free love, drug use, etc. This operation was also known as the Aquarian Conspiracy, which had its roots in the human potential movement and was designed and implemented by social scientists like Willis Harman and Theodore Adorno through organizations like Tavistock, the Stanford Research Institute, and the Institute for Social Research at the University of Frankfurt. The philosophy of Paulism was designed to replace the Abrahamic religions, and especially Christianity, with Luciferian spiritual concepts which would ultimately lead to a new worldwide religion. This is why John Lennon says in his song I Found Out that he saw religions from Jesus to Paul, and then saying in an interview that by 2012, Paul will be Jesus. Why 2012? Because many occultists believe December 21st, 2012 was the official beginning of the Age of Aquarius, or the Age of Lucifer. For followers of Crowley, this would parallel the Aeon of Horus, which according to Aleister Crowley began in the 1900s. The Beatles' role as a creation of Tavistock was instrumental in bringing about the New Age. Many are familiar with John Lennon's song Imagine, but have not actually taken the time to absorb the lyrics. Imagine is an ode to the philosophy of the New World Order. There is virtually no difference between the message delivered in Imagine and what internationalist organizations like the World Economic Forum promote as their vision for the future. And as a side note, We are told in memoirs that John Lennon did not write Imagine. The book tells us the song was generously credited to him. So the idol worship of Paul and the Beatles, whether one believes in the Paul is dead conspiracy or not, is enabling the strategy of the controllers, which has been underway in earnest since the early 1960s. And because many don't see the bigger picture, they cannot break the conditioning of worship and idolatry they bestow upon Paul, the Beatles, and the multitude of other celebrities and entertainers that permeate our controlled reality. This continued worship allows the social scientists to navigate the thoughts and behavior of the unknowing masses toward the endgame strategy of a one-world order. I have explained in a number of presentations and interviews, anything worth knowing is a lie. And what this means is if the truth about a particular aspect of your life would contribute to the betterment of your life, in other words, allow you to thrive, then the controllers will corrupt the truth in order to keep you from awakening. Believing the lies keeps you controlled. And as I've stated so many times, the music and entertainment industries, which are completely controlled, are a huge tool in the arsenal of propaganda and conditioning techniques used by the controllers. There is nothing organic emanating out of the mainstream music business, and this includes the Beatles. As I've mentioned many times, the Beatles, along with the Stones and the entire British invasion, was an engineered movement created by Tavistock to fundamentally change the societal and cultural landscape. In fact, all genres of music are created by social scientists to implement their agenda. Genres such as folk, psychedelic, hard rock, metal, grunge, punk, techno, hip-hop, rap, etc. were all manufactured. The main problem is the vast majority of people are oblivious to the overarching control system in place, and this includes many within the Paul is dead community. They might post about the New World Order or the Great Reset, but their awareness is compartmentalized, where only certain aspects of the reality are controlled, while other areas, such as the origins of the Beatles, were unaffected by the tentacles of the controlling apparatus. Their conditioning keeps them from looking into the entire Beatle timeline because their programming tells them not to. The Beatles' Cinderella story is a great feel-good narrative which I used to believe myself. But once you make the effort to clear out the programmed clutter, you should come to the realization that the Beatles' story is mostly fiction, from beginning to end. People will ask, how can a conspiracy as large as the Beatles be put into play? This would mean the level of control is immense. And for many people, the thought that this much control does exist makes them fearful. So instead of confronting their fears with the truth, they fall back into the lie because the lie is comforting and accommodates their worldview, as unrealistic as it might be. We certainly see the control grid playing out today. How is it that every country, every media outlet, every government, every head of state, and every medical institution has the same scripted message across the world? It's because there is a centralized system which dictates how the world is going to operate in order to achieve the objectives of those residing in the pyramid of power. Most people live their life clueless as to how reality really works. But the people behind the curtain are constantly moving their chess pieces around the board, and music is a big chess piece. Critics of my research accuse me of intentionally trying to damage the legacy of Biopol and the Beatles because I have dared to research and investigate the entirety of the Beatle narrative. My findings and conclusions resulted in depicting a different story than what they want to hear. In other words, I'm not singing from their hymnal, and this presents a problem because I am questioning their religion, and this makes them uncomfortable and angry. Inner conflict is created when my research introduces a sequence of facts or theories which conflicts with their long-held beliefs of who and what the Beatles are. There is a small segment of the community that is so upset with my research that their behavior on social media can only be described as bizarre. Needless to say, such behavior has turned off many people who are open-minded and critical thinkers. By attacking me, they damage their own standing within the community while increasing the popularity of my work. This is not wishful thinking on my part. This is a fact. For example, I noticed the number of views for my presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, increased by 2,000 over the past couple of weeks. I thought this was interesting since the presentation has been up on YouTube for almost 2 years. Then a couple of days ago, a colleague reached out to me to let me know the Justice for Biopol crowd was taking yet another run at trying to debunk the documentary. This, of course, piqued the interest of people and resulted in a significant number of folks heading to my channel to watch my content. This phenomenon is known as the Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is when a person or party is engaged in tactics which try to keep others from looking at something, in this case my research, and then the exact opposite happens. Those that think for themselves become curious and end up checking out the forbidden fruit. What the haters don't understand is if they redirected and invested their efforts in their own work instead of trying to attack me, they would be making greater strides in getting their own message out. Instead, they have contributed to the growth of my audience. The people engaging in this childish behavior bank on the flawed premise that most people think like they do, when in fact, most people do not. This is why when people ask me about responding to these antics, I tell them not to worry about it. Focusing on people who operate in a field of dense and negative energy will only lower your own standing. It's always best to move forward and not get yourself entangled in someone else's nastiness and unproductive behavior. If you want to make progress in life, then follow your passion and pursue your will. Since 2016, when I first started my research into the McCartney and Beatles topic, my presentations and interviews have achieved over 2.2 million views and listens worldwide. The detractors constantly talk nonsense about Tom and I working together or saying, I work for Billy. I'm a Freemason, I'm an occultist, I'm in the Illuminati, and on and on. It's all utter nonsense. A friend wrote me recently and told me about another ridiculous premise where I am using hypnosis to mind control people into believing the Beatles did not write all their own music. So now I have magical powers. This is comical because believing the Beatles did write all their own music is a direct result of Tavistock's mind control program, which created the entire Beatles backstory of John and Paul being brilliant and prolific songwriters. The irony of this logic is colossal in its stupidity because it's the other way around. It's the people promoting the official narrative who are engaged in mind control as they either knowingly or unknowingly continue to enable Tavistock's fictional Beatles story. Whereas my work has always been dedicated to exposing the lies of the system and getting to the truth, whether it be the Beatles conspiracy or any other aspect of the Matrix. For example, I have done a number of interviews discussing how the media uses mind control to manipulate humanity. Friends have told me about comments in posts where the person posting the comment states they have spoken to me on the phone or on Skype. More fabrications. With the exception of my immediate family and close friends, I rarely speak to anyone on the phone or on Skype. In fact, I'm never on Skype except to conduct an interview. One person has made delusional statements about conversations they've had with me, conversations that never took place because I don't talk to this person. The only conclusion I can come to is the people fabricating these lies have a deep-rooted psychosis. Many people in general have little to no concept of Tavistock's mission, who, under the auspices of the Committee of 300, created a cradle-to-grave narrative around the Beatles. This included manufactured stories and content which was disseminated through their vast network of media outlets and resources, which included radio, TV, movies, books, magazines, fan clubs, and documentaries. Defenders of the Beatles writing all their own material will point to YouTube and other audio clips as proof of the lads writing their own music when in fact these clips prove nothing. What the Paulist believes is based on what they are told by the official narrative or some unverifiable source. There is no first-person accounting of the content. The video description box might say the recording is from 1963 and people run with it without verifying the integrity of the source. I am unaware of any authenticated film footage of the Beatles actually recording in the studio and laying down the final tracks for an album. The closest we come is the Get Back sessions, and even that footage is highly suspect and riddled with gaps. We have to ask the question, how is it that the most famous rock band in the world has no film footage that definitively documents their recording in the studio? Many of the tracks people are listening to from the early period are the Beatles rehearsing the songs they were learning in preparation for playing them on the road. There is zero proof that these recordings ended up as the final recorded track on an album or single. And even if someone wants to argue that this is the case, then how do they know who's actually playing on the recording since there is no visual content to help with verification? I did an analysis to understand how many of the approximately 90 original songs between 1962 and 1966 were actually performed live, and that number is around 25. What happened to the other 65 songs? Why did the Beatles not play one song from their Revolver album when they went on tour after the album's release? My guess, it was because they hadn't learned the songs. Because just like Rubber Soul, the Beatles did not play on Revolver. They only sang the vocals. All the instrumental tracks were recorded beforehand using studio musicians. The Beatles' job was to come in and record the vocal tracks. I also suspect EMI created audio content knowing it would end up in the endless mix of clips and bootlegs that permeate the Beatle landscape. Wouldn't it be nice to see the lads on film in the studio recording Day Tripper? I have also shown videos of the Beatles playing live with evidence that their performance was augmented by either a backing track or off-stage musicians. I also pointed out that many of the audio tracks to online videos were enhanced post-production because the recording technology back in the day could not capture the level of quality and clarity we hear in many of these clips. All of this is standard operating procedure within the music industry as a whole, but to the Paulist, the Beatles transcended the norm and none of these standard practices apply to them. The defenders will also point to books written about the Beatles, including those documenting their time in the studio. They again fall into the trap of trusting the official narrative as a source. The first question we should ask is, was the author a first-person witness to any of the events they are writing about? If not, then who supplied the documentation to the author? Perhaps the author, who has good intentions, is being used unknowingly to perpetuate the official narrative. History is loaded up with well-documented lies. Many people today understand the JFK assassination was a government conspiracy involving the CIA, the FBI, the Dallas Police Department, organized crime, and LBJ. Yet, Lee Harvey Oswald is still in the history books as the lone gunman. Because something is well documented does not mean it's true. To quote Napoleon, history is a set of lies agreed upon. Many deniers refuse to acknowledge the Masonic and occult underbelly of the Beatles, which was there from the very beginning. When I came out and said all of the Beatles were Freemasons, there were those in the community who scoffed. When the evidence became overwhelming that the lads were indeed in the Brotherhood, the deniers then adjusted their position by saying maybe they were Masons, but they were in the lower degrees. What they don't understand is a Mason is bound by their oaths, or what is referred to as their obligations. And there is a hierarchy within the Masonic order, where the lesser degrees report to the higher degrees. The Masonic structure is exactly like a corporate structure. The same issue arises when calling out the occult symbolism surrounding the Beatles. At first, there was the typical denial. How could the four lads be involved in such a thing? But when myself and others began presenting image after image of occult symbolism around the band, the apologists had to backpedal. They revised their talking points to explain away the overt use of symbolism by saying it was the result of the system they were plugged into, that the lads didn't know any better. They just did what they were told to do. Such an argument does not help their case, since it strongly implies the Beatles were being handled, and if they were being handled, it's hard to make the argument they were organic. Now, how much the Beatles knew about the occult is a legitimate question, but they were not oblivious to the overall agenda. The fact is, they knew they were participants in a deception. They knew they didn't write all their own music, and they knew they did not play on all the recorded tracks, especially during the 1962 through 1966 period. After 1966, we hear more of their own compositions, as well as hearing them play on more of the recorded tracks. However, my theory also posits that outside songwriters and studio players was still employed between 1967 and 1970. The Beatles becoming more than a singing group started with the release of Sgt. Pepper and in particular with the White Album. And ironically, this increased level of participation can be attributed to Billy's efforts to engage them more in the creative process and recordings. George Martin, on the other hand, who I view as the managing director of the operation, had no time to waste with teaching and nurturing a bar and club band on how to write music. He was on the hook to produce 7 albums between 1963 and 1966, and he had to accomplish this while taking an inexperienced group of young men and turning them into a worldwide phenomenon as the machine behind the curtain turned out the songs that would be credited to the lads. What many people don't know is it is common practice for professional songwriters to assign credit to an artist who in fact had nothing to do with writing the music. Now, if we look at the early Beatle timeline, we are told by the official narrative that John and Paul wrote 100 songs between 1956 through 1962 when they met George Martin. The question is, where are those 100 songs? In 1956, Bio Paul was 14 years old and John was 16. In August of 1960, the lads are taken to Germany by then-manager and handler Alan Williams. Before Williams, Pete Best was involved in booking the band's gigs. Pete's mother, Mona Best, was the proprietor of the Casbah Club, which she ran out of the basement of her house, and where the Beatles, and as the Quarrymen, played some of their early gigs. In an interesting twist to the plot, Mona gave birth to a child named Rogue in 1962 with a man half her age, and that man was Neil Aspinall. Aspinall was a school friend of Paul McCartney and George Harrison, and later on went on to become the top executive of Apple. In an interview Pete Best did years ago, he tells us in Hamburg, the band would play for 7 to 8 hours a night, sleep, wake up at 3 p.m., and then head back to the club by 6 p.m. One would be hard-pressed to convince me any music was written during their stints in Hamburg. Even the mainstream narrative tells us Hamburg was a time of honing performance skills, not songwriting skills. The Beatles' live gigs were virtually non-stop during and after Hamburg. The constant playing was not an endeavor to learn how to write songs. It was training to strengthen their performance skills in preparation for playing the songs live once Tavistock threw the switch on Beatlemania. So from 1960 through June of 1962, the Beatles were a young and rough-around-the-edges bar and club band that played cover songs. On January 1st, 1962, the Beatles had their Decca audition where they allegedly recorded 15 songs in approximately 6 hours. Of the 15 songs, we are told 3 of the songs are original Lennon and McCartney compositions. Those songs were Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Loved of the Loved. Like Dreamers Do and Hello Little Girl were officially released with Anthology in 1995. So again, the narrative claims John and Paul wrote 100 original songs between 1956 and 1962, yet the Decca session had them playing 3 original compositions. I have a CD which contains recordings of the Quarrymen with a version of I'll Follow the Sun and One After 909. The CD states the songs were recorded rehearsals from April of 1960. We might ask the question, if I'll Follow the Sun and One After 909 were in the backlog as early as April 1960, why were they not included as part of the Decca audition? Why did I'll Follow the Sun not emerge until 1964 when it was released on their 4th album, Beatles for Sale? And why did One After 909 not emerge until the Get Back sessions 9 years later in 1969? Why were both songs not included on the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me, or on their second album, With the Beatles? I would argue both songs are far better compositions than Love Me Do or the song Misery. It's possible that I'll Follow the Sun and One After 909 were ceded to the Beatles early on in order to bolster the historical timeline, or the demos were created after the fact and backdated to 1960. In either case, if we use the Decca demo as a baseline, the lads had 3 original compositions going into 1962, or at the very least, 3 original compositions they considered worthy of recording. And I cannot discount the possibility that the original songs on the Decca tapes were ceded to them to get the ball rolling. On June 18, 1962, which coincidentally happens to be Biopol's birthday, the band signed their contract with EMI. Paul is now 20 years old and John is almost 22. As I've documented a number of times, George Martin was not impressed with the band as a whole. And we're not talking about their lack of songwriting skills, but also their playing ability. George Martin tells us he thought their music was rubbish and they had nothing behind them, and he needed to find songs for them to record, which syncs up nicely with the 1962 Mercy Beat article, which reported that the Beatles were heading to London to record songs written for them. Martin also makes the comment that he likes their voices, which would support my theory that their role was limited to singing vocals. We also need to remember that George Martin turned Brian Epstein down the first time Brian brought the demo recordings to George. It is explained in memoirs that George Martin was overruled and instructed by a superior, and I will assume within the Masonic hierarchy, that he had to take them on board. So the Beatles signed with EMI effective June of 1962, and then, a mere 9 months later, EMI releases their debut album Please Please Me on March 22, 1963, which is symbolic of the occulted Skull and Bones number of 322. We are told that the Beatles recorded the majority of Please Please Me in one long recording session at EMI on February 11, 1963. We again have the highly suspect and questionable cycle times that permeate the Beatles' official narrative. Of the 14 tracks on Please Please Me, there are 8 original compositions, which were I Saw Her Standing There, Misery, Ask Me Why, Please Please Me, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, Do You Want to Know a Secret, and There's a Place. Please note, none of the original songs from the Decca audition make the album, nor did I'll Follow the Sun and One After 909. It should also be noted that between June of 1962, when they signed with EMI, and February 10th of 1963, the day before they recorded the 10 songs for Please Please Me, the Beatles were playing live gigs continuously with performances in England, Wales, West Germany, and Scotland. When was their time to write and rehearse 8 original songs? And what happened to the backlog of 100 songs, which by this time has fallen off the radar? It's my theory, just like with Rubber Soul, the Beatles came into EMI on February 11th to lay down the vocal tracks for the Please Please Me album. And to be honest, to believe they nailed all the vocals and harmonies for 10 songs in a single session is not believable. In my opinion, there's more to the Please Please Me story than what we are being told. So a more reasonable explanation of what happened is this. George Martin got right to work after the Beatles signed in June of 1962, and he selected cover songs and had the quote original compositions written. He then recorded the songs with session musicians. All he needed to do after all the instrumental tracks were completed was to add the vocals, and that is what I would suggest the Beatles did for 13 hours on February 11th. Then if we look at their second UK album release with the Beatles, we see the same pattern. Only 8 months after the release of Please Please Me, EMI released with the Beatles on November 22nd, 1963, the same day as JFK's assassination. And of course, November 22nd regroups to the number 33. We are told the recording sessions took place between July 18th and October 23rd of 1963, and the Beatles Bible tells us the album was recorded in just 7 non-consecutive days over a 3-month period. What the Beatles Bible and Wikipedia don't tell us is the exact dates for those 7 days the lads were in the studio. And like Please Please Me, With the Beatles also contains 8 original songs. If we look at the Beatles' live performances between February 12, 1963, which is the day after their marathon Please Please Me recording session, we again have the lads continuously playing their live gigs. Their live performance schedule spanned the entire 3-month period when With the Beatles was being recorded. So again, when were they writing and rehearsing these songs for the album? We are asked to believe that in between their constant gigging, they were heads down, writing and rehearsing songs, and were able to knock 14 songs out, including 8 originals, in 7 days. If you want my opinion, that did not happen. To get the album done in, quote, 7 days, all of the songs were written beforehand by professional Tavistock or EMI songwriters and then recorded by session players. Once the instrumental tracks were recorded, George Martin had the Beatles come in and sing the vocals. That's what the lads did for 7 days. They laid down the vocal tracks. A good benchmark to measure whether the Beatles were capable of pulling off these types of cycle times is to reference the recently released Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson. The original plan for Get Back was to have the Beatles write, rehearse, and record 14 songs in 2.5 weeks. Based on the Please Please Me and With the Beatles narrative, 2 weeks to record 14 songs for Get Back should have been a walk in the park. But that is not what we witness in the film. Instead, in Get Back, we see them struggling to create material over a 30-day period of time. So, 10 of 14 songs nailed in 1 day for Please Please Me, and then 14 songs banged out in 7 days for With the Beatles. Yet, with Get Back, they couldn't complete 14 songs in 2 weeks and ended up playing 5 songs on the rooftop consisting of 15 minutes of music once we back out the additional takes. And then releasing what many believe to be was their weakest album. So something is very off with the backstories we are given regarding the early period of Beatle history. In my presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, I deconstructed the Rubber Soul sessions where the mainstream narrative tells us the lads came into the studio on October 11th, 1965 with no backlog of music. They proceeded to write from scratch, then rehearsed, arranged, recorded, and mixed 16 original compositions in 30 days. My research determined the timeline of the official narrative did not work because it was not possible when factoring in all of the processes involved in the recording and releasing of an album. My Rubber Soul analysis concluded there was a behind-the-scenes template of outside songwriters and studio musicians creating the music while the lads came in to do the vocals. I theorized this process was used throughout the Beatles' timeline, but more so during the 1962 through 1966 period. The interesting thing is, this model is not unique. It was the pop music template that was used throughout the 60s and 70s, and it is what I refer to as the Wrecking Crew model. The Wrecking Crew was a loose collective of Los Angeles-based session musicians whose services were employed for thousands of studio recordings in the 1960s and 1970s, including several hundred top 40 hits. The musicians were not publicly recognized in their era, but were viewed with reverence by industry insiders. They are now considered one of the most successful and prolific session recording units in music history. The Wrecking Crew coalesced in the early 1960s as the de facto house band for Phil Spector and helped realize his wall of sound production style. They subsequently became the most requested session musicians in Los Angeles, playing behind many popular recording artists including Jan and Dean, Sonny and Cher, the Mamas and the Papas, the Fifth Dimension, Frank Sinatra, and Nancy Sinatra. The musicians were sometimes used as, quote, ghost players on recordings credited to rock groups, such as the Byrds' debut rendition of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, the first two albums by the Monkees, and the Beach Boys' 1966 album, Pet Sounds. It is without question that the Wrecking Crew model extended beyond Los Angeles, and other units of professional session musicians performed the same function over in England. In fact, Vic Flick, who was in the George Martin Orchestra, played the James Bond-sounding intro to Help on the U.S. album release and playing on Ringo's theme in A Hard Day's Night. The official narrative tells us Andy White drummed on Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, and Andy probably drummed on a lot more than 2 songs. The famous session drummer Bernard Purdy stated back in the 1970s that he drummed on 21 early Beatles songs, a claim he has never backed off of. A relative of another great drummer, Ronnie Verrill, contacted me to tell me Ronnie also played on Beatle tracks. Another possible musician on the early Beatle records is Big Jim Sullivan, who was one of the most sought-after session guitarists in England. Jim is also an accomplished sitar player, and it's likely it is his sitar we hear on Norwegian Wood. It is also possible that Billy, who was a session musician himself, played on early Beatle recordings as well. There is a reason why George Harrison titled his last album Brainwashed. Think about it. The link to my presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, is in the description box below, along with a show I did with Ofer Zevi, where we discuss the 1960 through 1962 period. Thanks for listening.